Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Toronto Apologetics. We're glad that you could be with us this evening. So good evening to all our hosts and folks on the East End and the Eastern Standard Time Zone. If you're across the globe and the other part of the world, well, top of the morning to you. Good morning. Really glad to have you along on this episode. We want to encourage you to like our video. The more likes we get, the more we can get the video out there. This is going to be a very important topic that we're going to be discussing tonight. And we also encourage you to subscribe to Toronto Apologetics. We're a ministry that addresses the various issues related to the defense of the Christian faith. And so we deal with various topics, many diverse and sundry issues and subjects. Those of you who are following the channel will know that we can deal with issues as far to the spectrum of dealing with politics, to dealing with church history, to dealing with social justice, to dealing with political correctness, to dealing with Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so forth, Judaism. So we deal with a plethora of different topics. And so we are going to be discussing tonight a very important topic, and it's going to be related to Islam. And we are going to be discussing in particular a constant claim that Muslims make, and that is that the Quran knew about various scientific truths, and that the Quran also predicted certain things, like I've heard even Muslims say that it predicted the Apollo landing on the moon and so forth and so on. And there are many claims that are made by Muslim friends in terms of the so-called scientific miracles in the Quran. And so I thought of no one better than to have my good friend Thaddeus from Reasoned Answers to be with us tonight to address one of these important subjects. And tonight we're going to be talking about embryology. The science of human development from the embryonic stage and forward. So Thaddeus, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on today. Like you said, we're going to be looking at embryology. We had a show a while back, I don't know, maybe 2 months ago or so, where we looked at the general idea of scientific miracles in the Quran with a couple specific examples. But I think embryology is probably like the granddaddy of them all. This is the one that they always appeal to first and foremost. So we're going to be taking a more careful look at this particular claim.
Yes, I know that back in the 1990s, Thaddeus, I know I'm showing my age here, but back in the early 1990s, it was the rage among Muslims about the so-called scientific miracles. And being myself from Toronto, a very well-known professor here, I believe it was physiology, if I'm not mistaken. There was a professor at the University of Toronto that Muslims were quoting, Dr. Keith Moore, and saying, look, even the scientist from the University of Toronto admits that the Quran has this miraculous claim about embryology. And I actually contacted Dr. Moore. I don't know if he's still alive, but I remember giving him a phone call. We had a discussion. And he was very upfront with me that he did no Arabic. He was only going on what the Muslim apologists were telling him. And so suffice it to say that it's not that he did a thorough research into the language. He just went by what the guys were telling him. And so we will, I guess we'll touch on that as well. But in your experience, Thaddeus, is this something that you continue to hear from Muslims? They also tell me that the Quran speaks of the Big Bang. It talks about an expanding universe and so forth and so on. So I'm sure this has been your experience.
I don't think it's quite as popular as it once was. But when, Zakir Naik was the main guy, this is like his whole shtick is these scientific miracles. I'm a medical doctor and I say that the Quran has science in it, so you should trust me. And he goes to some pretty extreme lengths, and as a result of that, I think people have noticed that some of these claims are just so ridiculous that even the Muslim has trouble seeing how it could be true. So I think people have definitely backed away from it some. But like you said, it was very trendy at a time. I was only a teenager in the 90s, so I don't know firsthand. But I definitely have, read Muslims from the earlier days of the internet, where this was the main subject that they were debating with non-Muslims: is, does the Quran contain scientific claims? And it wasn't just more. They managed to trick a few other prominent experts in their field as well. That they went to them and they said, "Oh, here's what the Quran says. How does that match up?" And of course, they had already interpreted the Quran in such a way that it would match up. And they're like, "Yeah, if the Quran really says that, that's pretty amazing." And then, of course, you only get the little quote, "The Quran is amazing."
Yeah.
And then they spread all these things. And Moore never did officially say that he disavowed it. When he was asked about it, a dozen years later, he said, "That was a dozen years ago. I don't talk about that anymore."
Yeah.
But all the others came out and flat out said, "We were tricked. We were given false information, and we retract our statements."
Yeah. Yeah. And on top of being giving all these false information, I think they were taken around the world for special lectures, and they were showered with various gifts and so forth and so on. And so they were being wooed, really, when you think about it. And I think it's also important to note that there have been a number of responses to these claims. And, Dr. William Campbell himself, a Christian doctor, wrote a book on this, the Bible, the Bible, Quran, and Science, and wherein he gives these responses. But I think it's also in the name of consistency. I think you would agree with me, Thaddeus, that we need to be careful. I mean, there are Christians who think that, we can get the Bible the Bible talks about cars, automobiles in the book of Nahum, those chariots with flames, those are cars, maybe the Batmobile. But as you know, there are also, Christians who would also make similar claims, and we have to, in the name of truth and consistency, say, well, let's really look at the context here and see if that's really what the text says. And so we're not having one criteria for the Muslims and another criteria for Christians. We're saying, let's look at the evidence. So let's talk about embryology then, Thaddeus.
Absolutely.
Did you want me to bring up your slide?
Yeah, you can bring up the slides here.
Okay.
So as we've said, we're going to be talking about embryology today. And I'm going to be basing it off this paper by Sabaha Sadat, Human Embryology and the Holy Quran, an Overview. This is a 2009 article. It was published in the International Journal of Health Sciences, which is a somewhat credible journal. It's not like a pay for publish type journal. It is published by a public university in Saudi Arabia, but nonetheless it is a reputable source. So this is probably the best Muslim attempt out there, at least the best I found. So I'm going to the best is what I'm trying to say here. Sure. And I'll let him introduce the subject in his own words. He says, man's quest to know about his origin has led him to search for his roots, and the best source for him has been religious scriptures. The greatest miracle is the Holy Quran. There is an elegant description of origin, development, and step-by-step development stages in the intrauterine life in the Quran. Muslims had this knowledge in the 7th century, and Prophet Muhammad's Hadith, sayings, deeds, approvals, narrated by authentic narrators, had explained almost everything about natal and even postnatal events. These findings, once presented to experts in the field of anatomy and embryology, surprised them, and they believed that the knowledge given to the Prophet Muhammad was indeed divine. Who else would provide the knowledge to the Prophet Muhammad except the Creator himself? Yeah. So this is the introduction to his pseudo-scientific paper here. Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to start with a couple, before we get into the specifics of his paper, I wanted to start with a couple reminders from the first episode. And the first is, why should Christians care about this? I know when I publish videos on this subject, they tend to be on the lower end of my typical views. And I think that's because to non-Muslims, these things are so ridiculous that they don't even feel they need to be addressed. Like they can look at these claims and say, you're clearly just reading something into the text. But because of this, it allows the Muslims who have a very different point of view that this is very important to many Muslims. It's something that is often taught to children. It's something that many Muslims have grown up hearing and they still believe as an adult. So this is actually one of the more important arguments they have for Islam. And I found that often Muslim confidence in Islam is based more on the information, one might even say lies, they've been taught about other religions, and especially Christianity, that they've been taught how false other things are, and a lot of their confidence is based on that. So this is actually one of the few positive arguments. It's not the only one. I mean, I'm not saying it's the only argument they give, but it's one of the few that's actually a positive case. And for that reason, a lot of Muslims that, you ask them why you believe in the Quran, why you believe in Islam, and they'll say it contains scientific knowledge. It contains advanced knowledge of the future, something like that. And additionally, as long as one believes in the Quran, believes that it's the literal word of God, because it contains scientific miracles or whatever, then the type of arguments that we more typically use against Islam won't have much of effect, because you can excuse pretty much any behavior. We typically make moral arguments saying that Prophet Muhammad did all these disgusting things, and they'll just dismiss that one of two ways. They'll say, well, either he did it, so therefore it's okay, or they'll say he didn't do it because he must be a good prophet. It must be a perfect example. So whatever the text says, doesn't matter. He didn't do it. So these moral arguments, while effective, they also are kind of not addressing the Muslim's reason for believing in Islam. So they're not necessarily as effective they would be if you take away this idea of scientific miracles. So just there are a number of verses that address human origins in the Quran, but the main one that we'll be looking at carefully is Surah 23:12 through 14, quoting Sahih International here. And certainly did we create man from an extract of clay, then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. Then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot, and we made the clot into a lump, they add of flesh, and we made from the lump bones, and we covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed him into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. Surah 22:5 contains a similar idea. O people, if you should be in doubt about the resurrection, then indeed we created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clinging clot, and then from a lump of flesh, formed and unformed, that we may show you. And we settle in the wombs whom we will for a specified term, then we bring you out as a child. So in this verse, it's the same basic sequence, but it's using this as a reason. Like, if you're doubting that the resurrection will occur, well, look back on creation. Look what Allah did. So Allah is suggesting that this is a reason you should believe in him. So unlike the usual scientific miracle claims, which are just total inventions of modern Muslims, this one is something that Allah himself cites. He says that because this happened, this is a reason you should believe that I'm the creator, that what I say is true. And then a briefer version in 40:67, same idea. It is he who created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, from a clinging clot, then he brings you out as a child. And there are some other verses that don't give a sequence, but are used to add additional information, or are cited by apologists. And we'll see a couple of those as we go along, but these are the main ones here.
Right.
So we'll also want to review the criteria. I won't go into great detail since we covered these before, but just to put them out there, we need to have some sort of criteria to judge a miracle claim by. Otherwise, we're just using our subjective interpretation. The Muslim will use his subjective interpretation and say that this is clearly scientific foreknowledge, and the non-Muslim will look at it and they'll say, it clearly isn't, according to my subjective judgment. So we need some objective criteria. First one's pretty obvious. It has to be true. It has to match scientific knowledge. Second criteria is that the insight must go beyond what anyone could observe using their own eyes and whatever technology was available in the 7th century. Obviously, if a human being can observe it, it can't be counted as a scientific miracle or advanced knowledge. Criteria 3 is that the claimed knowledge must be new to the Quran. Now, Muslims will confuse this and they'll say, well, Muhammad couldn't have copied from this source because of X, Y, and Z. That's not the point here. The point is if another human being could come up with this idea in a previous source, whether or not Muhammad had access to that source and the information in it, it clearly demonstrates that a human being at or prior to the 7th century could come up with the idea. So it couldn't be used as evidence that it has to come from a divine source. Criteria 4 is that the Quran must actually say what the apologist claims. And of course, this one is the most important because this is where the miracle typically happens. We call it the miracle of reinterpretation. You start with the answer, and then you make the verse fit the answer by whatever means you need to. And it may look convincing. You have someone who sees this in the verse, and you look at it and say, yeah, I could see how the verse could say that. I guess it's true. So how do we judge this? Well, I suggest that we look at classical tafsir, and I'll look at the 3 best tafsir or most popular tafsir, Ibn Kathir, Al-Tabari, and Al-Qurtubi. Muslims are welcome to look at another one as long as it's from pre-modern times. A modern tafsir doesn't do you any good because they already have the answer in hand. But they can look at another one and see if someone saw it, because the Quran it claims to be perfectly clear.
Yeah.
And if it's perfectly clear, then surely at least someone saw this advanced knowledge there. I'm not saying every single person who would read it necessarily had to, but surely at least someone saw it if it's really there. And 2, if it's going to be used as evidence, again, someone has to have actually demonstrated that it says it.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily rule out the possibility the verse could mean that, but you can't use it as evidence unless there's some reason to believe that someone saw that.
Right.
And then the final one is that it must go beyond a lucky guess. So one we looked at last time to illustrate this was the claim that the universe is expanding. Well, there's only 3 possibilities. It's expanding, it's contracting, or it's staying the same. So guessing which of those 3 isn't all that impressive, even if it was just a pure guess with no prior knowledge. So those are our criteria. Anything you want to add before we jump into the specifics?
No, it's pretty straightforward. Yep.
Excellent. So we start here with what I called stage 0 because the paper that we look at just ignored this part of the verse. And the first part of 23:12 through 14, specifically verse 12, and certainly did we create man from an extract of clay. And this is ignored by our article, like I said, and most other apologists who go to embryology ignore this. Although some do try to take this and say, well, here are the chemicals that you find in clay, and hey, a lot of those chemicals are in human beings, so see, this is part of the miracle. But really that's nonsense, because the chemical composition of clay is not very similar to the chemical composition of human beings at all. Sure, they share some chemicals in common, but any 2 objects are likely to share some chemicals in common.
Sure.
So that's not very impressive. And in fairness, it is justified to skip past this part because the classical tafsir do generally see this as describing Adam. So
right.
We created a man out of clay. The Islamic version, the most common version of the Islamic creation story is that Adam is created out of clay, made a model, and then Allah brings him to life. So it does make sense that this, we made man from clay is referring to Adam, not part of the embryology process. And then there's a quote there from Ibn Kathir to verify that.
Right.
So I'm willing to grant that that's not really part of it. And we'll move on to stage 1, the drop stage, or the nutfa in Arabic. First, the verse from Sahih International, verse 13. Then we placed him as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. Then I'm going to read the extravagant claim of Sabaha Sadat. Hey, maybe he's right, though. Maybe the Quran does actually say everything that he claims. So this is how I'm going to do it in general. I'm going to read his full claim from his paper first, and then we'll see how his claim relates to the criteria. So he says, nafta means a drop, and amshag means mixtures. This term describes the mixture and convergence of male and female fluids in the uterine or fallopian tubes to form a zygote. It has the form of a drop of fluid and consists of a mixture of male and female secretions. The nutfa amshag can be subdivided into stage 1.1 here. The calc stage, when the male and female secretions meet, they may or may not form a conceptus or a zygote. If a zygote is formed with 46 chromosomes, a new being will be produced. The process of formation of a single individual by fusion of two secretions has been aptly termed calc. Before I read his 1.2 stage, I want to point out a couple things with this. First of all, this amshag term is not in 2313. He's imported that from 76 2, I figured out, without him actually saying that. He doesn't say where it came from, but that's where it came from. And that verse reads, indeed, we created man from a sperm drop mixture that we may try him. We made him hearing and seeing. So when we look at the criteria, we'll consider both verses, 23:13 and 76:2. And the calc is simply we created, which comes from verse 14, so I'm not sure how he's determining that's a stage, but that's where it comes from. And then he says stage 1.2 here is the takdir stage. The human creation begins with formation of a zygote, but what are its characteristics? Well, what inherit from his father and what from mother. This process takes place a few hours after the calc phase. The Holy Qur'an called it takdir phase, and modern scientists call it genetic programming. The takdir in Arabic means planning, determining, or programming. Very similar indeed. The Quran indicates that these processes occur in immediate succession, and we know that the processes are completed less than 30 hours after fertilization. The process of sex determination takes place at this stage. The Quran states in Surah and Najm that, and he did create the two sexes, the male and the female, from nutfa, when emitted or planned. We know that if the sperm with a Y chromosome fertilizes the ovum, it is a male child, and if a sperm bearing an X chromosome fertilizes ovum, it is a female child. So, I don't know where he determined this from, that the Quran calls this the takdir phase. Takdir refers to Allah's decree. It occurs in a number of verses in the Quran, none of which are related to embryology. So unless you have a guess, Tony, I don't actually know where he's importing that idea from.
Yeah, I'm not sure where he's importing it from either. Yeah.
All right. Well, he didn't provide any explanation, so we will just.
But it's mubin, right? It's all clear. The Quran is
very right.
Clear. Yeah. And the more you're talking about these things, Thaddeus, it seems more and more it's actually unclear.
Yeah, and when we look at the tafsir, we're going to see that the tafsir are often unclear about what these verses meant too.
Yeah.
Strangely enough.
Yeah.
And then finally, stage 1.3, the harf phase. When the phases of calc and takdir are completed, the zygote migrates from the fallopian tube to the uterus, where it implants itself similar to a seed planting in soil. It gets embedded in the endometrium and receives its nourishment and develops a different shape and structure. It is mentioned in the Quran that the endometrial lining of the uterus is similar to the soil in which a seed is embedded. During this stage, the real settlement begins and is described in the Prophet's Hadith as the angel enters upon the conceptus, which apparently is the nutfa now, after it rests in the uterus for 40 or 45 nights, which comes from Sahih Muslim. We'll get a chance to look a bit at that hadith when we get to the criteria. But first, where did he get this idea that it's the harth phase? Well, that word only occurs in the Quran one time. This is the word translated as tilth in the famous Quran 2:223.
Yeah.
So he got it from there.
Yeah.
Which I in this particular case, I really like the Yusuf Ali version, so that's what I'll read. Your wives are as a tilth unto you, so approach your tilth when or how you will.
Yeah. So it's a field compared to a field.
Yep. So your women are a field, which apparently means that the endometrial lining of the uterus is like soil.
Crazy. Yeah. So that word only appears once, which, the technical term is hapaxilgamenon. It's a term that only appears once in the Quran. But when it does appear, it is in a sexual context, but it's comparing your wife to a field. And then the Hadith talks about, various positions on how you can, fertilize your field. So that may be a topic for another day.
Well, we will touch on it briefly since it's part of his claim. We will look at what the tafsir say about 2:223, and your interpretation is correct. It is about sexual position, not about the endometrial lining, shockingly enough.
Right.
So we start with the first criteria. Is this claim even true to begin with? And although the guy who wrote this is a medical doctor, a real one, unlike Zakir Naik, who just makes that claim, he does some stretching of the medicine in addition to stretching the Quran. So I gave him a grade of sort of here. He's clearly trying to make the Quran fit science. I mean, he took, 6 words and expanded it into 4 paragraphs, saying that the Quran said all of this stuff in those 6 words. But even so, his mixing of fluids is not a very accurate description of the fertilization process. In fertilization, you have a single sperm penetrating the cell membrane of a single egg. Yeah. It's not really a mixing of fluids. Now, fluids do mix during sexual intercourse, but that's not what causes fertilization.
Right.
And then he has this hadith about the 40 days, and he didn't talk about the 40 days because it's clearly false. He's going to go on and say that this stage lasts for 2 days or 3 days, something like that. And the hadith says it lasts for 40 days, yet he quotes the hadith as an explanation and just ignores the 40 days part there.
Right. And let me just add, Thaddeus, that a lot of Muslims, when it comes to the issue of abortion, a lot of Muslims will appeal to that hadith and basically say that in the first 40 days, because according to that same hadith, a soul is given to that organism at the 40th day or following the 40th day. And so just to say that in Islam, one of the arguments they make for abortion, in favor of abortion, is that for the first 40 days that embryo has no soul. So again, I'm not trying to get off topic. I'm just trying to add a caveat there that is a hadith that many Muslims argue for when it comes to the topic of abortion.
Yeah, if you look at the hadith, I mean, I'm only going to touch on them briefly because, making scientific claims about the hadith is much rarer. But if you look at the hadith, Muhammad clearly thought that there was 3 stages of 40 days each, which is not remotely what the apologist is going to claim about what the Quran says.
Right.
But even though I said that this is a sort of true, I'll go ahead and give him a pass because, he could always just rewrite his description to be more precise and remove the unnecessary reference to the hadith. So, we'll give him a pass and say that he got the science right. So then we go to the observable criteria. So we have to define how we're going to grade these things. I'm going to generally grade them by the way Sadat claims. Mm-hmm. But also throw in some other information since, different people might view them differently. So if we're going by the way, he claimed all of that stuff. He gave a pretty detailed description. He won't give it nearly as detailed for all of the steps. So don't worry, I won't be like reading massive amounts of medical text. But he gave a very detailed description of this fertilization process. And if we say that, everything he claimed, well, obviously that was not observable. That requires a microscope and some pretty advanced technology as well, not just a microscope. However, if we're just talking about the mixing of sexual fluids, which is what the Quran seems to actually state, then yes, that can be observed. I won't be very explicit here, but I think you can figure it out if you're a married adult. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there was no discretion, no viewer discretion advice. So, yeah.
We will have one opportunity later on where I will give some viewer discretion advised, but not yet. So then we have to ask, is it the idea that human life begins with a drop, which is all the Arabic really says, that the translators added the idea of sperm. It really just means a drop of fluid, can be used as a euphemism for sperm, so that could be what the Quran means, but it really is just a drop of fluid. But the idea that humans began with a drop, well, is this original? Because this is the only words that are in the Quran, so this is the only thing we can judge whether this idea is original. Because if something else is the same idea and it really means all that stuff that Sadat claimed, well, then that other source means all that other stuff too.
Right.
So frankly, this sounds a lot like the common belief that semen grew up on its own once it made it to the uterus. This is the idea of Aristotle and others, that the female didn't contribute anything other than a place for the full genetic material provided by the man to grow up. Aristotle writes, now it is impossible that any creature should produce two seminal secretions at once. And the secretion in females, which answers to semen in males, is the menstrual fluid. It obviously follows that the female does not contribute any semen to generation. However, if we don't look at just 23:12 and we look at 76:2 as well, then this matches the other competing common idea of the time, expressed here by Hippocrates. Mm-hmm. In fact, both partners alike contain both male and female sperm. The male being stronger than the female must originate from a stronger sperm. Here is a further point. If both partners produce a stronger sperm than a male as a result, and then he goes on to describe what happens if they produce weaker sperm or if they have a mix of the two, determining what the sex of the child will be.
Right.
But we can see that, if we're just talking about mixing of the two fluids, it's found in Hippocrates. If we're just talking about the semen finding a home in the uterus, it's found in Aristotle. So no, regardless of what view we take of what the Quran teaches, it is not original to the Quran. So now we come to criteria 4, which is where we're going to have most of our fun today. Does the Quran actually teach it? So Ibn Kathir on 23:12, he doesn't write much. He just says that the drop is placed in the womb. But on 76:2, he does state explicitly that the male and female fluids mix. So looking all right for the Quran teaching this. Al-Tabari is similar on 23:12. He says the sperm reaches a safe place in the womb. No mention of mixing. On 76:2, he says that there are dozens of different opinions on what this verse means. The perfectly clear Quran, he cites a dozen different opinions. They boil down to basically 3, though. The mixing of male and female fluids, which he says is the preferred interpretation. He doesn't always give a preferred, but in this case he does. Mm-hmm. He also says that other people believe it's the male or female fluid becoming dominant, i.e. they're not mixing. One of them becomes dominant in some sort of battle, and that's the one that contributes to the child and determines the sex. Or possibly the mixing is not of two different reproductive fluids, but of water and blood. Al-Qurtubi on 23:12 just says that the drop means sperm. That's all he says about it.
Mm-hmm.
And on 76.2, he says the mixing of man's fluid, women's fluid, blood, and or blood clots.
Wow.
So any of those four fluids there, the man's sexual fluid, the woman's sexual fluid, that's a typo, the blood or blood clots is what is mixing. So he doesn't know which of those four things are involved, but it's some combination of them.
Yeah, the Quran is very clear on this. You can tell. You can tell by the commentators that the Quran is very clear.
Indeed. And finally, on verse 223, I didn't quote all of them, but they all say the same thing. All three of these commentaries, and probably just about any commentary you're going to go to, is going to say the same thing, that this verse was revealed specifically when someone had a question about approaching their wife from the rear, and that it talks about the permissibility of different types of sexual positions. You know, what position can you have sex in? And then they add in some talk about the woman being basically a place to grow crops. None of them use the word soil.
It's like Hugh Hefner wrote that verse. Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, supposedly that's why it was revealed. You know, one of Muhammad's friends came to him and said, "Hey, Muhammad, am I allowed to have sex in this way?" And he said, "Allah has just revealed that yes, you can. Women are just fields. You can plow them however you like."
Incredible.
So let's go ahead and go to the final criteria here. Is it a lucky guess? Well, my question is, what else could children be formed from other than something that's related to sex? I mean, I'm sure that every ancient person knew that when you have sex, there's a possibility of having children. So really the only possibilities are the man alone or the woman alone or some combination of the two. And as we've seen, you can interpret the Quran in two of those ways. So no, this does not demonstrate anything beyond a lucky guess, even if we're attributing the accuracy of Sadat to it. So before I reveal my conclusion about this first step, I'm going to have a conclusion about each step. Okay. What are your thoughts here, Tony? Are you convinced? You ready to convert to Islam?
I don't see anything miraculous. I think that the Aristotelian idea was floating around for a long time. And the language of Aristotle seems to be repeated in the Quran. I don't see anything extraordinary here. There's nothing here that would lead me to believe that there was some special knowledge that Muhammad received from God about human conception. And what keeps just jumping at me is that if the Quran is mubin, as it claims that this is a clear Quran in clear and pure Arabic, you would think that this matter would be settled, but at least Ibn Kathir is honest enough to say there's dozens of opinions on this. So it just seems to just cry out that this is definitely not a clear case or a settled case in the Quran.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and give a hint to any Muslims watching this that you do have another option. You can just say that this isn't making a scientific claim and that it's poetic. And then, all these debates about what it means won't really matter. And that's what I'm going to suggest Muslims do at the end.
Yeah.
But then you lose this as evidence for the truth of the Quran. You can't have it both ways.
Exactly.
So the conclusion, shockingly enough, no miracle here. This is just a vague statement that conveyed obvious knowledge and common knowledge of the day. Anything more that you claim, like all that stuff Sadat put into the 6 words, is nothing more than eisegesis, reading something into the text that is not there.
Yeah, yeah. And also, he's also preying on the ignorance of the Western reader. As you know, Thaddeus, it's most Muslims don't know Arabic. At least 85% of the world's Muslims are non-Arabic speakers, and they will use Arabic in their prayers, in their, when they do shahada or when they do the salat, the prayers. But for the most part, many of them are not familiar with Arabic. They only know it by rote memory because they repeat it during their prayers. And so there is a sense in which the Westerner, when he's reading this, like Dr. Keith Moore I mentioned earlier, he's at the mercy of the apologist. He's trusting them that they're being straightforward. But as you pointed out, Sadat is bringing in words from different parts of the Quran and giving you the impression that they're all over the place when they're not.
Yeah, we couldn't even figure out where he got takdir from, but he says this is the clear stage of what the Quran teaches. And he also doesn't even say what that really means in Islam, which is about Allah's decree. He says that this is the planning stage, or whatever description he gave. Right. And then he, after making up his own imaginary Quran verses, he said, "See how similar this is to the science."
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
So we'll go ahead and move on to stage 2, the clot stage, or the alaka stage. Mm-hmm. Sahih International is the first part of verse 14. Then we made the sperm draught into a clinging clot. We'll read what Sadat says here. So this is stage 2.1, the alk stage. The period begins on day 15 and is completed on day 23 or 24, when the embryo gradually acquires the shape of a leech. The Arabic word alak has 3 meanings: leech, suspended thing, or blood clot. There's a great similarity between a freshwater leech to early embryo. Enclosed picture shows the similarity between the two, and we'll see that picture on the next slide. The second meaning is a suspended thing, and that is what we can see the way embryo is attached to the placenta in this stage. Both these meanings describe and reflect accurately the external appearance of the embryo at this stage. The third meaning, the blood clot, describes the most important internal structure that affects the external appearance. For in the alak stage, blood is formed in the blood vessels in the form of isolated islands, and the embryo resembles a blood clot. Descriptions are given miraculously in this single word, alaka. Yeah, miraculously, it means all these things. And I like that he's taken the blood clot, which is the primary meaning of this term, and he's demoted that to number 3, because that's the one that he can least use to describe actual embryology. But in fairness, leech is a possible meaning of the term. It's a very obscure meaning, and I would suggest it's probably a derived meaning, i.e. blood clot was the original meaning. And because a leech sucks on blood and somewhat resembles blood, that it acquired that term from the meaning for blood clot. And suspended thing is also a possible meaning. That one's somewhat debated. But we'll take his Arabic claim for granted, because we'll look, as we know, any word that has multiple meanings, you have to look at the context to determine what the word actually means in context. And the native Arabic speakers who wrote the tafsir tell us quite explicitly which of those 3 meanings it has in this passage. But before we get to that, we have to answer, is it true? So this is the picture from his paper there. He has a picture of, a scientific drawing and a picture of a leech. No doubt he picked that particular picture of the leech and that particular picture scientific drawing because they have a somewhat similar shape. You could pick 2 different drawings, a different drawing and a different leech picture, and they might look nothing alike. But he's found pictures that kind of, sort of look similar. So is this one true? And here I'm going to have to say no, not really. Even though he's trying to make the Quran and fit the science, in this case, he has pretty badly butchered the science as well. First of all, no textbook in the world is ever going to describe an early stage embryo as resembling a leech. That's just a totally arbitrary decision. You could say, it's not very descriptive. It's just a few cells. You could say it resembles just about anything. So that's completely arbitrary. Suspended is questionable as well. Now, of course, it's going to eventually be true that the developing embryo or developing baby is suspended. But here we're just talking about a couple cells. It's more implanted than suspended.
Right.
And a 2 to 3 week old embryo, because that's what he said, 14 to 23 days, I believe, is definitely not a blood clot in any sense, which is why he had to go through the gymnastics to say, well, you know, it has blood in it and it's developing from blood. So that's why it uses that term.
Mm.
So on this one, we have a couple pictures of what a embryo at this stage actually looks like. The first one is kind of a conceptual drawing. You know, it has a space where these cells are developing into. You know, it's just a few cells, like I said.
Yeah.
They're kind of, you know, just dividing as kind of just a blob at this point. And the second one, this is actually electronic scanning tunneling microscope image. So this is an actual image. The colorization is arbitrary just to distinguish the different features, but this is what it actually looks like. And yeah, I don't see a leech there.
Yeah, neither do I.
So question 2, is this observable? And the answer here is going to be yes. And this, we're going to see a common pattern here. But basically all of the stages that the Quran claims can be observed by simply looking carefully at miscarried fetuses at different stages, which is why we're going to see that other sources came to the same conclusions, because this is readily observable without a microscope. So if you look at a very early stage miscarriage, it's going to look basically like a blood clot.
Yep.
Indeed, I decided not to put a graphic picture here, but I did do a search, and I found tons of pictures of women posting pictures and saying, I can't tell, did I have a miscarriage or is this a blood clot? And, you know, looking for advice because they knew they were pregnant and they were concerned they might have had a miscarriage at the very early stage. And that's probably all the Quran verse is really saying, is that it is a blood clot, or if we're being generous, resembles a blood clot.
Right.
So the next question, is it original? Well, probably not, although no source I found used the term leech, at least. So if it really says that, then I guess it's an original idea. Aristotle writes, it follows that what the female would contribute to the semen of the male would be material for the semen to work upon. So remember, Aristotle thought that the male alone was providing the genetic material. So what is the female's contribution? The menstrual blood is used as food for the developing embryo, basically. Right. Which could be interpreted as the semen causes the menstrual blood to clot. I put a question mark there. I mean, it's not like explicit in the writings of Aristotle, but you could certainly get that idea from it. A lot easier than you could get what Sadat writes from the Quran. Let's put it that way. Hippocrates, moreover, it grows because of the mother's blood, which descends to the womb. Oh, you mean like a leech that sucks on things to get blood out of it? Very interesting there.
Yeah.
And Galen says, it was necessary, therefore, that the fetus adheres to its mother as the seed of the plant must adhere to the earth. And elsewhere in his writing, he refutes the idea that a child is formed from a blood clot. Now, if he's taking the time to refute an idea, that means someone was suggesting this as an idea. Right. You know, we don't necessarily have a source that explicitly says from ancient Greek medicine, but of course only a tiny fraction of the literature written survives. Right. But he's taking the time to refute the idea, so there's probably someone who is suggesting this idea. So he's refuting it, which means the idea is out there. Right. And finally, the Talmud states, it may be inferred that the embryo clings to the sandal of the middle of the ladder, i.e. that it's suspended or clinging or hanging like the Quran supposedly claims. And as we know, the Talmud is a major influence on the Quran. Yeah. So if this verse actually means that, and again, I think it probably just means blood clot, but if it does contain the idea of the very early stage embryo clinging to the lining of the uterus in some fashion, hey, it's right there in the Talmud. No miraculous knowledge needed.
Yeah, and also to bear in mind that the Talmud is pre-Quranic as well. So the Talmud predates the Quran at least by 400 years.
That is correct. For some unknown reason, you'll occasionally find a Muslim apologist trying to claim that the Talmud copied from the Quran, but that's absurd because the Talmud originates around the year 250 for the earlier part of it and is completed around the year 450. So, who knows? So, does the Quran teach it? Well, the answer is no. Well, unless we're granting that the Quran is teaching the most apparent meaning, but also completely inaccurate meaning of the fetus developing from a blood clot, because that's what all of the tafsir say. Mm-hmm. They don't spend a lot of time talking about this. They think it's pretty darn obvious what the Quran means here. I guess here the Quran is rather clear. Ibn Kathir explicitly states that the fluid turns into a blood clot. Whatever the mixing of those fluids was, and he did say it was a male and female reproductive fluid,
right?
They transform into a blood clot. Al-Tabari says it's a piece of blood. Pretty clear description of a blood clot there. And Al-Qurtubi says he doesn't talk about the meaning of alaka on 23:14, but when he talks about 22:5, he calls it solid blood. Another pretty clear description of a blood clot. No indication of leeches, no indication of suspending, no indication that there's some sort of hidden meaning here. Everyone just thinks that whatever the mixing of the fluid was, it turns into a blood clot. So finally, we have to ask, is this something that couldn't just be guessed from a random lucky guess? And this one's always a little hard because it's like, well, what am I evaluating here? Well, remember, I'm actually trying to evaluate what Sadat claimed, not necessarily what the Quran says. So, he makes that rather extravagant claim, and development could, in principle, occur in any order. So if the Quran actually said what he claimed, that, it resembles a leech and it's suspended and whatnot, well, then I guess that couldn't be a lucky guess, because that is pretty detailed. That is pretty unlikely thing to guess. So I give this one a pass, i.e. that it's not just a lucky guess. Again, ignoring that it really means blood clot. Mm-hmm. So conclusion, I should have asked you your conclusion first, but I have a feeling we're going to agree here.
Yeah.
That there's no miracle here. It's just a factually incorrect statement about blood clots. The Quran is a factually incorrect statement about blood clots. Modern attempts to change the meaning demonstrate that the Quran is in error, not that it's a scientific miracle.
Right.
Because if it's clear, it means blood clot. And if it's not clear, then you can make it whatever you want it to mean.
Exactly.
All right, so we got the stage 3, the mudgaha. We made the clot into a lump of flesh. Second thought of verse 14. Once again, the words of Sadat here. The second stage is the mugdaha, which means a chewed substance. The embryo changes from the halakha to the mudgaha stage at 24 to 26 days. The word mudgaha means something that has been chewed by teeth, a piece of meat of chewable size, or a small substance. In this phase, the embryo resembles a chewed substance, but still bears the teeth marks. The embryo shows the distinct somites which resemble teeth marks in the embryo's body. The second and third meaning of mudgaha apply to the embryo in relation to its size, which is approximately 1 centimeter in length, the size of a chewable object. Outside surface in al-kaha stage is smooth, and in mudgaha it acquires furrows, swellings, and corrugated surface, which gives the embryo the chewed appearance. Very interesting description of an embryo here.
Yeah. It looks like the gum after I've chewed it and throw it out. Okay.
And indeed, look what we have here. We have a picture of chewed gum.
There you go.
This isn't from his paper. He did have a paper in there, but the picture was very out of focus and wasn't very clear what he was trying to show. So I went and found a different Muslim site. And look what they've done. They've shaped a piece of gum into the shape of this picture. And then they've bit it precisely to make it look like the picture that they're trying to copy.
Wow.
Note that this is a piece of gum, not a piece of meat. Go ahead and try to make similar teeth marks in a piece of meat if you like.
Yeah.
I have a feeling you won't be very successful. But as we'll see on the next slide when I show, on this slide in a second here, when I show a picture of what the embryo actually looks like, it doesn't really look that much like this cartoon drawing that wasn't intended to, be like super precise picture. It's trying to show, it is a scientific drawing. It's making points, but it's not like trying to provide a graphic picture of what it looks like.
Right.
So is it true? Well, we're going to have to say that this one's another kind of true, but not really. No textbook is going to describe an early stage embryo as resembling chewed meat or showing teeth marks. And I mean, he's right that the embryo is small, but that's hardly a shocking observation there. And of course, that's a secondary meaning of the term as well. So what does a embryo at this stage actually look like? Here's an actual picture of an embryo around day 20. As you can see, the so-called teeth marks on the scientific drawing don't really look all that much like teeth marks in an actual photograph. This is the very beginnings of forming the spinal column.
Yeah.
So, they're kind of sort of like the vertebrae is what it's really like.
Right.
And I mean, you can see how the scientific picture does resemble the actual picture, but it doesn't look all that much like it. And it certainly doesn't look anything like that piece of gum, let alone an actual chewed up piece of meat.
Right.
However, it does look a lot like what an actual miscarried fetus from this stage looks like. Does actually look a lot like a chewed up piece of meat. So is it observable? Yes, an early miscarriage can resemble chewed up meat. So warning, graphic content here. So if you don't want to see bloody pictures of miscarriages, turn away. Here we have 3 different pictures, and they do look a lot like chewed up meat. I will give them that. But again, that's how someone could make this conclusion in the 7th century.
Mm-hmm.
So the next question is it an original idea to the Quran? Well, this one's a little harder to answer. I'd say probably not, but the other sources are much more specific, and they don't necessarily convey the idea of a chewed piece of meat because they're more specific, and the Quran's just providing this general term. You're not going to get an exact word for word match here, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle says the more solid part comes together, the liquid is separated off from it. And as the earthly parts solidify, membranes form around it. Some of these are called membranes and other chorea. Hippocrates, at this stage, with the descent and coagulation of the mother's blood, flesh begins to be formed with the umbilicus. Galen, the 3rd period follows on this when, as we said, it is possible to see the 3 ruling parts clearly and a kind of outline, a silhouette, as they were, of the other parts. So the 3 ruling parts are the major organs of the body, i.e. Galen's telling you exactly how he made this determination. He did some very careful observation and could see them.
Yeah.
So, the Quran, even if it did have this knowledge, and it's less specific again, but even if it did have this knowledge, how did it come up with it? It observed it, just like Galen did.
Yeah.
And then finally, the Garbha Uphindas, which is a Hindu text from the 2nd millennia BC even. It's a very, very ancient text. After a fortnight, it becomes a spherical mass. And, a spherical mass, a chewed up piece of meat, I mean, they're both vague descriptions of what an early stage fetus looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I gave that one a maybe a little bit, since none of them specifically said chewed. So does the Quran teach that this lump is chewed meat? Well, this one actually is kind of close. The tafsirs do actually talk about it being, at least Qurtubi does talk about it being chewed. None of them mention teeth marks, though, and that's completely an invention of the modern Muslim, trying to make their piece of gum look like like the medical drawing. But Ibn Kathir says that it's a piece of flesh with no shape or features. Well, hold on a minute. It's a piece of flesh with no shape or features? I thought it had, these teeth mark shapes in it, or that it resembled chewed up meat. But he just says it's pretty indistinct at this stage. I mean, not an inaccurate description, but hardly a miraculous description there. Al-Tabari doesn't seem to care about the shape of this stage at all. He just repeats the words of the Quran, and he does the same thing in 22:5. He just kind of repeats the words that it became a lump. I guess he thinks lump's probably indescript enough that there's nothing to say about it.
Right.
And Qurtubi says he doesn't talk about it on 23:14, but on 22:5 he calls it a little meat. So he does get the idea of it being small, and he says it's chewed. So we do actually get some of the description from Sadat. So, he got a little bit right on this one. The commentaries do at least see this as a possible meaning. So he gets a little bit of points for this one. I think this is the only one where he gets any points for the Quran teaching it. And then finally, would it go beyond a lucky guess? Well, if we take the teeth marks eisegesis out, then no, it's too vague to say anything. It just says a lump. I mean, a lump isn't telling us anything, so that anyone could guess it looks like a lump.
Yeah.
But since we're looking at Sadat's claim and not what the Quran says, then we'll say no. If it actually knew that there was the development of vertebrae precursors, then it would be beyond a lucky guess. Shockingly enough, conclusion, no miracle here. It's just a vague statement that is easily observed from miscarriages. Early embryos resemble a lump, and you could even say they resemble a lump of chewed up meat if you like.
Yeah.
Stage 4, the bones. We made the lump bones, and the from has to be added into by Sahih International to make this into a complete thought. It really just says 3 words: we made lump bones. That's all that it says in Arabic. But Sadat, once again, has seen vast amounts of information in these 3 words. He writes, the izam, which means bones in Arabic. I don't know why there's parentheses there, but that was in the originals.
Okay.
The embryo stays in the Mudgaha stage for up to 6 weeks. In the beginning of the 7th week, cartilage skeleton begins to form, and eventually the embryo takes the human shape with formation of a skeleton. Bone formation is sequential. Which is short for something scientific. Ossification centers appear in the femur in the 7th week, in the sternum and the maxilla in weeks 8 to 9. With this stage, the embryo takes the human shape, and this fact has been verily described in the following hadith. So the hadith here, when 42 nights have passed from the time of nutfa, time of conception. Notice he's translated it 3 different ways now.
Yeah.
Same word.
Yeah.
Allah sends an angel to it who shapes it and makes its hearing, skin, sight, muscles, and bones, narrated in Sahih Muslim. And then he adds his own commentary. Before 42 days, embryo cannot be distinguished from embryo of other animals, but at this stage it becomes clearly distinguishable. Well, I dispute the accuracy of that statement, right. But it's actually irrelevant because that's him making a commentary on the hadith, so we won't go back to that.
It's also interesting that in that hadith, Thaddeus, that the angel shapes it and makes it hearing, sight, skin, muscles, and bones, which is interesting because now It says Allah is the best of creators, but now you seem to have an angel actually cooperating in the creation of a child in the womb. So it's almost attributing to the angel this divine act. Sounds a little shirky to me, Thaddeus. I don't know about you.
Yeah, you're right.
Sounds a little shirky.
So, I won't comment greatly on the Hadith, but notice what the Hadith actually claims. So Sadat's citing this to say that the human being has a distinguishable shape at this point, which he's interpreting as meaning it has a skeleton. So he's taken the Hadith, he's interpreted the Hadith to teach that it has a shape, and then he's read that shape into the Quran. So several levels here, but it also explicitly claims that this is when the baby begins to hear, when it begins to see, when it begins to have skin, and when it begins to have muscles. Remember, 3 40-day stages. That first 40-day stage, it actually corresponds to the 8 to 14 days in Sadat's writing. Mm-hmm. So this really is taking place immediately after that first stage, but because it says 42 days, which is kind of close to 6 to 8 weeks, he says, yes, see, this is what this Hadith is about. And it gets the skin, muscles, and bones, and sight and hearing, all at this stage.
Right.
He won't talk about any of those other things for some reason. He only wants to talk about the bones.
Right.
I wonder why he doesn't talk about any of those other things.
Yeah.
So we asked this question: is it true? Well, yes, the science is fine. This one he didn't stretch the science. He accurately described the science. But note that he did slip in this cartilage skeleton, i.e. it's not actually bone. It's cartilage. Mm-hmm. Precursor to bone, but not actually bone.
Right.
Which is not what the Quran says. And the Arabic does have a word for cartilage. People of the 7th century realized that things like your ears aren't exactly bone.
Your nose.
Yep, they are, they're solid like bone, but when you die, they go away. They're not bone. Right. So people knew that. They had a word for it. The Quran doesn't use that word. They could have. And as I already pointed out, he conveniently ignored all of the rest of the Hadith, and he did that because it's inaccurate. It has nothing to do with development taking place in this time period. So the next question is, would it be observable that at some point the developing baby has formed bones? And again, yes. All you have to do is examine a miscarried baby of sufficient age, and it will show that it has bones. Here are 2 X-ray type pictures, not technically X-rays, but of babies at different stages. You see the first one is an earlier stage where it hasn't formed the legs yet, and here's the later stage where it's formed the legs. But you can clearly see the bones have formed in both cases, or at least bone-like structures. They're really more cartilage at this point, as we'll see in a later slide. So is the idea of bones developing at some point during formation of a child unique to the Quran?
No.
And the obvious answer is, of course, no. People knew bones were formed at some point. And our article is ignoring that the Quran's claim that the lump was turned into bone. So are we. We're justified in ignoring that part of the verse and only looking at whether bones being formed is what it's, since that's what he claims it's teaching. He's ignoring that the lump turned into bones, which is what the Quran seems to teach, because he doesn't want to say that because it's not true. So he ignores that part. Mm-hmm. So we can as well. The book of Job has something similar. And I'm not to be clear, as part of the Bible here, I'm not claiming that this has any advanced scientific knowledge. I'm just saying it uses similar language. Remember that you formed me as if with clay. Will you return me to dust? You poured me out like milk, and you pulled me together like cheese, and then you clothed me with skin and flesh. And inside me did you interweave bones and sinews. Hippocrates, the bones grow hard. Moreover, they send out branches like a tree. A much more detailed description, and I would say more accurate as well. He knows that the bones, he doesn't necessarily know that they're cartilage, but he knows that they're originally soft and they harden as development taking place, and then additional bones are developing as the baby develops, as we saw in those 2 scans where later stages they have more bones. And we'll come back to Galen because his quote is very, very similar to what the Quran says.
Let me just add, just for our viewers, if they want to know where to find that quote from the book of Job, it's Job chapter 10. Job chapter 10. And let me just try to get the right verses here in case you're interested. So it's Job 10 verses 9 to 11. So Job 10 verses 9 to 11. If you guys are interested in finding the source, Job 10 9 to 11. Yeah.
Yep. So it talks. The author of Job talks about bones being interweaved into the existing skin and flesh, similar to what the Quran's describing here, where the lump of meat or flesh or whatever it is exactly has bones forming in it.
Right.
So does the Quran actually teach this? And we'll give Sadat this one. So I was mistaken earlier when I said that he only got points for that one, because he gets points for this one. The Quran does teach this, because remember, he's only actually claiming that bones formed at some point. So yes, the Quran does teach that bones formed at some point during development. Nothing about it being precisely week 6 to 9. He obviously just took the knowledge of when it forms and added that part. But maybe he wasn't claiming the Quran said that. Maybe we'll give him credit. Anyway, Ibn Kathir says, we give it shape with a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs, and its bones, nerves, and veins. Ibn Kathir seems to know more what's happening than the Quran does. But, he's interpreting the Quran, so we'll pretend that he just got all that knowledge from the Quran. Very good. Well done. Al-Tabari doesn't discuss the bones, except to talk about a textual variant in which reading is correct. So he doesn't make any claims about development of the bones. And Qurtubi cites the same hadith as Sadat does, but otherwise doesn't comment on the bones. So he does see that hadith and this part of the Quran are related, but he doesn't comment on the formation of the bones. Again, perhaps the Quran is just pretty obvious what it means, that bone was formed out of the flesh, so no one feels the need to elaborate. So does this go beyond a lucky guess? Well, on our reading of the verse, it's only claiming that bones were formed at some point, which frankly is patently obvious. A baby's born with bones in it.
Yeah.
The bones had to form at some point, so no guess needed here.
No rocket scientist there, no.
But if we go with what the Quran actually says, which is inaccurate, which is why Sadat didn't claim it, that the flesh turns into bones, that would go beyond a lucky guess, but it's also false. So this one gets a no, because could this be a lucky guess? Yes, it could be a lucky guess, because we're only claiming that bones were formed, which is what he claims. So before I reveal my grand conclusion here, what do you think? What about this stage 4 here?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. There's nothing extraordinary here. I mean, families who've had miscarriages, they know that a miscarriage can look like a clot. Those who've lost a child in stillbirth can tell there's bones that have formed already in the body. So these are things that would have been readily observable throughout human history. And so there's really nothing here that meets the criteria of a miracle.
I see our good friend Alonzo Harris is in the chat. He says, I've never read Ibn Kathir. Sam Shamoun is my authority on Ibn Kathir, which is amazing because I have it open on my other window if you really want to see from me doing the research and getting the exact quote from Ibn Kathir.
Yeah.
And I did not consult an article by Sam. I did consult a number of articles written by people to get information, but I always go back to the primary source because I don't just trust what people write. And it'll actually be apparent on a later slide because I couldn't confirm what someone claimed about Galen. And as far as I know, Sam did actually write an article on this specific subject because I didn't come across one while I was doing research. So there you go.
Yeah. 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 And the wonderful thing is all of these resources are readily available online. So there's really no excuse not to study them in their original context.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who wants to can go read Ibn Kathir and see if I misrepresented him. I mean,
yeah, tafsir.com, I think it's called. Yeah.
Al-Tabari or Qurtubi are going to be a little bit more complicated. They're not readily available in English.
Yeah.
So, conclusion, no miracle here. Sadat has conveniently ignored the verse talking about the bone being formed from the lump. So all we're left with is something that's easily observed, and even if it was not easily observed, it's also easily inferred from babies being born with bones.
Yeah. I don't know if you're a parent, but I'm sure when you had your child, you realized the child had bones. So nothing extraordinary here.
So stage 5 is the flesh stage, the laham stage. We covered the bones with flesh, is all the Quran says in the Sahih International Translation. Sadat, however, says laham, al-kisa bil laham, clothing the bones with flesh. We have already seen that skeleton is formed in the 7th week, and the differentiation of muscle starts in the 8th week. In other words, myogenesis takes place during this stage. Development of definitive muscles starts in the trunk, and the fetus starts moving. The muscles take their position around the bones. The sequence of events is very fast, as is mentioned in the Quran. The use of fa, an Arabic conjunction, which means rapid sequence of events. That's not really true, but the Quran states the fact as, then fa, we clothed the bones with lam, muscle, flesh. Notice that he's interpreting it two ways, muscle and flesh. The passage also indicates that lam stage represents the end of the embryonic tachlic stage, which is followed by the nasha stage. The conjunction thumma, which also means then, indicates a slow sequence with a time lag between the two stages. Now, as near as I can tell, there is a difference between fa and thumma, but it's that fa follows directly, and thumma there is a unspecified amount of time in between. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually about speed, it's about whether the next event follows directly from the previous event.
Right.
So is it true? And this picture here, earlier when I said we get to see about cartilage, this is the blue portions of the skeleton, and if you're watching on a phone, it's probably going to be too small to see. You can watch back later on a computer. But the blue portions of the skeleton at week 10, remember that he's claiming this takes place at week 8, and there's fully formed bones apparently. All the sections in blue are cartilage at week 8. And then by the time the baby's born, they've all turned into bones except for the joints basically, which are cartilage even in children and adults. Mm-hmm. So is this true? Well, again, I'm giving them the grade of sort of. The muscles do not take their place around the bone, which it was his description of what happens. Myoblasts, which are not actually muscles, they're the precursors to muscle cells, take their place around cartilage, as both the bone and as both the cartilage is developing into bone and the myoblasts are developing into muscles. They're taking place at the same time. They are not a sequence of events. And I did give him a grade of sort of, because he doesn't actually butcher the science. He just played a little game where he expected you not to notice. So the previous stage, he said, took place from stages 6 to 9, especially in week 8. And here he's saying this stage is represented by weeks 8 to 9, i.e. he's overlapped them. They're completely overlapped. They're happening simultaneous. Mm-hmm. So he hasn't necessarily butchered the science. He's just pretended they're sequential when they're actually taking place at the same time.
Right.
So in other words, he correctly identified that the bones and muscles are forming simultaneously, but pretended they are distinct stages because the Quran makes them distinct stages.
Right.
So I give him a grade of sort of on the science, even though he was deceptive on his use of language. So is the existence of flesh observable? Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
this is really, I think the verse is just a poetic way of saying what everyone knows, that a human being is bones covered with flesh. That's probably all it's really saying. It's probably not really talking about, some special distinct stage where the muscle, which probably already existed in the Quran's view, decided to cover the bones because, well, for one, no one would be stupid enough to observe a miscarried baby and be like, that has only bones. The muscle must have formed later. So I'm being generous here and saying that's not what the Quran says, even though you could interpret that way. You could say that the flesh turned into bones and then muscle was added. But if we're just talking about, the more realistic interpretation, you can also observe miscarried babies yet again and see that at some point they have fully formed muscles.
Yep.
So is this original to the Quran? And this is the most clear-cut no of them all, because basically the same language even is used in our sources. Not just the same idea, but the same language. Yeah. Same verse from the book of Job that we saw earlier. You clothed me with skin and flesh. So the Quran says you clothed the bones with flesh. The book of Job says you clothed me with flesh. And then it also talks about bones.
Right.
Slightly different word order, but same words, same idea. And Galen, which I skipped earlier because I wanted to save it to now to reveal, says, thus it caused flesh to grow on and around the bones. Exactly the idea that the Quran seems to be describing, that the muscles are growing on the bones. It made at the ends of the bones ligaments that bind them to each other, and along their entire length it placed around them on all sides thin membranes called peristyle, on which is caused flesh to grow. So first you get flesh on the muscles, and then you get flesh on the membranes. Yeah. Considerably more detailed than what the Quran offers, and arguably equally correct.
Yeah.
So the idea already exists before the Quran.
Galen was a prophet of God, of Allah as well.
I guess so. And, Galen is the one that most closely resembles the Quran. So sometimes people make this incorrect claim that the Quran borrows from him. I don't think it does. I think it's just conveying popular knowledge, which is a mixing of a bunch of different ideas. Sure. But Muslims will say, he says different things here and there, so Muhammad couldn't have copied from him. Well, ironically, Muslim apologists from before the time of modern science, and I didn't put this on a slide, but I can pull the quotes up later if someone is really interested. They can ask me in the comments. They actually try to say that the Quran had this miraculous knowledge because it matches what Galen taught. Mm-hmm. But, Galen was still the best knowledge of development at the time they were writing. So they're like, look, see, the Quran matches the best scientific knowledge of our day. Of course, they didn't use that term, but the best scientific knowledge of our day. Therefore, the Quran is miraculously correct. So they themselves are claiming that it has the same ideas as Galen. I don't need to go to a critic of Islam. I can just look at Muslim apologists from, the 12th century, and this is what they're saying.
Yeah, exactly.
So does the Quran teach it? And interestingly, no. The tafsir don't actually seem to have any knowledge of what is happening in this covering. So they don't mention muscles specifically. So if we're saying that the verse means muscles specifically, then no, they don't seem to know. They basically just repeat the words of the Quran, adding nothing to it. Ibn Kathir says we gave it something to cover it and strengthen it. I guess he adds the idea of strengthening. Mm-hmm. Al-Tabari literally repeats the words of the Quran. He has nothing to add. He quotes the Quran and then he paraphrases it. He adds nothing at all. And Qurtubi has some strange, bizarre metaphorical interpretation. And I think that he's really trying to say the passage as a whole, as opposed to this verse specifically. But it comes in his commentary on this portion of the verse, says that it's tied to lineage, that probably the passage as a whole is talking about how everyone's descended from Adam, that babies are descended from their parents and so forth, and ties it to this somehow.
Right.
So no one ties anything about, muscles forming around the bones. So if that's what the Quran's teaching, no one apparently saw it. Lucky guess, yes or no. Well, if we're talking about the verse meaning muscles are formed last, as Sadat claims that it means, then that would definitely go beyond a lucky guess, because, the development of the various structures of the body in principle could go in any order. So if you're just going on a pure guess, yeah, I'd go beyond a lucky guess. So I give him a pass here. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts from you?
Well, again, this and your presentation has been great, Thaddeus, but I'm just not impressed with Sadat's argumentation. It's incredible that people actually think that this is a miraculous revelation. It really isn't.
Yeah, and again, this article was published in a somewhat credible scientific journal. It is published by a public university in Saudi Arabia, like I said, so that's how they got through the editorial process. But it is a peer-reviewed journal. It's a legitimate journal. It does legitimate science, and they chose to publish this. So, it just shows you that in the Muslim world, there's plenty of people who still believe this. Despite some having backed away from it, there's plenty of people who still believe this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So my conclusion, same as yours, nothing going on here. Yeah. So that just played a little game. He said there are two different stages, both which take place in week 8. So he pretended there's 2 stages to hide the real error that the development of bones and muscles are happening simultaneously, not sequentially. And the saying, in any case, was found in previous literature, and we don't see any evidence that the Quran actually teaches what Sadat claimed either. So big time fail on this one.
Yeah.
He does offer a 6th stage, and I put a question mark here because most Muslim apologists don't offer a 6th stage. They end their discussion here. But remember, he's only at week 8 or so of development, so he's got to get this baby to term somehow.
Yeah.
So he takes the rest of the verse and he calls this the growth state, or the nasha. And he says, the actual verse says, then we developed him into another creation. He interprets this to mean that growth is taking place. He writes, the word nasha in Arabic means to initiate, grow, and develop, to rise and increase. This phase begins from the 9th week to term and is further divided into 2 stages. I cut off most of his words here because he's just describing what actually happens in development. There's no reason to tie it to what the Quran says whatsoever, so I won't read it there. But basically, it accurately describes what takes place from week 9 to the time birth takes place. So after describing the rest of what takes place, he then makes this conclusion, based on his own description. The Holy Quran has explained with precise definition and elegance this stage of intrauterine development, and the meaning of nasha applies clearly. So the fact that growth occurs clearly describes every type of growth that occurs from week 9 to giving birth. The meaning to initiate describes the initial function of various organs and systems. The secondary meaning to grow indicates the rapid growth and the development of various organs. The third meaning to rise and increase describes the very rapid and obvious increase in fetal size and weight. Keep in mind, obvious increase, hint, hint. Therefore, the term nasha clearly and accurately describes the fetal period. And then he quotes Surah 39:6, of which usually isn't necessarily quoted in the same context of embryology, but is definitely quoted as a scientific miracle by Muslims. He makes you in the wombs of your mother in stages, one after another, in 3 veils of darkness. I'm not actually sure which version that is, because this is him quoting. And that's definitely not Sahih International, just to be clear. He probably picked the translation that best fit. But in any case, the three veils of darkness may be referred to the interior abdominal wall, the uterine wall, and the embryonic membrane. The interpretation seems to be the most logical from the embryological point of view. Get that. From the point of embryology, this is what the Quran means. Mm-hmm. He literally just stated how his methodology. He starts with what embryology says, and then he determines what the Quran says from that.
Right.
With grace and elegance has been described in the Holy Quran.
Yeah.
All right. So, the previous stages, I was charitable. This stage, I'm sorry, but this stage is just so ridiculous that I'm not going to be able to be charitable, because all the Quran says is growth. And he's made this ridiculous assertion that it describes everything in precise details from week 6 to birth. Yeah. So is it true? Well, yeah, he just inserted the science and from the single word growth. Is it observable? Well, yeah. As Sadat said, it's obviously growing. Yeah. All you have to do is look at a pregnant woman and see her belly's getting bigger.
Yeah.
And a baby is way, way bigger than a sperm. So yeah, it's growing. Amazing science here.
Yeah, I mean, if it's alive, if it's living, then it's growing. I mean, it's just common sense.
Yeah. So is the idea of growth original to the Quran? I'm sorry. Trying to keep a straight face here.
It's hard. It's very hard.
So, I mean, do I really have to quote other texts to prove that people knew that babies grew in the womb? Well, let's just go ahead and do it anyway. Yeah. Hippocrates, as the flesh grows, it is formed into distinct members by breath. Aristotle, is expedient for the safety and growth of the fetus that no weight should be upon the uterus. And Sadat himself, actually, I didn't quote this part, but he actually admits this, that Galen knew this, because he says it's not known when scholars realized that human beings were developing in uterus. Well, I think it's known. It's probably the very first human being realized that the very first time a human being got pregnant, they probably realized that the baby was growing.
Yeah.
Anyway, then he goes on to say Galen in his second book, in his second century, Galen in the 2nd century AD had described the placenta and membranes in his book. So he admits that Galen knew this in the 2nd century. Yeah. So does the Quran actually teach this? Well, no. And by this, I mean all the, not the word growth, but all the stuff that Sadat claimed about the growth from week 9 to birth. In fact, the tafsir are quite unsure what this verse means at all. They have no freaking clue what this verse means. That all have formed a new creation. There are tons and tons of different interpretations, and Ibn Kathir always picks one. But, Al-Tabari and Qurtubi, which quote lots, they just go on and on and on. It's like all this text on these few words because there's so many opinions on what it means.
Yeah.
And about the only thing that they don't offer as an interpretation for this verse is, quote unquote, everything else in the growth of the baby.
Yeah, yeah.
So Ibn Kathir says we breathed a soul into it, which does seem to be the most common interpretation. Like you actually alluded to earlier, that at this stage, the 40-day stage, if we're going by what the the Hadith actually say, not what Sadat pretended they say, that this is when the soul goes into the baby. Al-Tabari gives that opinion, plus he says it could be the spirit. It could refer to what happens after birth. Like, this might not be about the baby at all. It might be literally everything that happens in someone's life from the time they're born to the time they die. And he describes all those things. It might refer to the drinking of breast milk and other infant activities. It might refer specifically to the development of hair, or it might refer to the development of character, or it might be a summary of the preceding ideas.
Yeah.
Verse 12, verse 13, and the first half of verse 14. And so this one statement that I'll create a new creature is a summary of everything that I already said. Qurtubi also gives many opinions, and only some of them agree with Al-Tabari. So we're up to 10, 15 different interpretations in total. He does list the soul. He says this verse might refer to the precise act of being born. It might refer to hair. It might refer to hair and teeth together. It might refer to, quote unquote, the perfection of youth. I don't know what that means precisely, but those are his words. Or it might refer to the development of intelligence-related traits throughout life. You know, the ability to think, to recognize you're a person. He lists a whole number of things, but they all seem to be tied to intelligence. So what is the Quran perfectly clear here?
Not at all.
Yeah, apparently not. The tafsir have no clue what this phrase means, but apparently it means everything that occurs from the 9th week of development up until the baby's born. For some reason, Allah didn't seem to need to give us a description of any of those things. So is this a lucky guess? Well, if the verse just means that development continues, possibly from the muscles, if we're granting that the previous verse meant from the development of the muscles all the way until birth, well, no. You don't need a guess to know that development continues throughout the time the baby's in the womb. That's just kind of pretty blatantly obvious.
Yeah.
So, again, no miracle, just a very unclear verse that you can read whatever you want into, as the tafsir do, and as Sadat does, even though his interpretation is precisely none of the dozen interpretations offered by the tafsir.
Right.
So those are the 6 stages here. We do have to also look at the darkness, though, since he also made this related but different claim about 3 stages of darkness. So I won't restate his claim, but we'll just look at the criteria. So is it true? Well, I mean, Sadat admitted that he took something that was true and decided that that was the logical meaning for the verse. So, yeah, it's true. But even given that, note that the 3 layers are somewhat arbitrary. You know, he picks 3 particular layers, but one could pick other layers. You know, there are actually many layers of human tissue between the skin and the developing baby. So other Muslims, in fact, do pick different things for the 3 layers. They all, of course, pick precisely 3 things, but they vary on what those 3 things are because it's arbitrary to say there's precisely 3 layers. So is it observable? Well, yeah, you could cut open a pregnant animal, or actually even a non-pregnant one, and that you can see that there's multiple different layers between the skin and the uterus, and that there's the skin, the muscles, and so on and so forth. So regardless of what layers you decide to pick as your 3 layers, they could be observed from the dissection of animals that were killed for food or whatever, or the dissection of dead human beings as well, which, of course, ancient people did know how to cut open human beings and did sometimes do that in an attempt to gain scientific knowledge.
Yeah, and when we think of cesarean sections, we know that people did practice cesarean sections, and any physician in the ancient world who had to rip open a woman's uterus from the muscles and the skin and the muscles obviously would observe these various layers.
Yeah, it was actually the normal Roman custom when a woman died before giving birth, a pregnant woman died before giving birth, was to cut her open after she died, take out the baby, and bury the 2 separately. So, they could easily observe this directly from human bodies.
And cesarean is taken from Caesar. So
exactly, yep. That's where the term gets its name from. It's from the Roman practice. That predates the writing of the Quran, I might add.
Exactly.
So is this idea of 3 layers of darkness original to the Quran? Well, maybe it is. I didn't find any text that specifically said 3 layers. I did find a source that claimed that Galen said this, but I couldn't find it in his writings. So maybe he said it, maybe he didn't. I'm not claiming he said that
Hmm.
because, like I said earlier, I'm careful. I go to the original sources. I don't just take what someone says for granted. So maybe it's original to the Quran, maybe not. I don't know. Interestingly, this picture here is a intravenous ultrasound. This is actually the picture of a blood vessel or a vein. And it has actually 3 distinct layers that scientific literature sometimes describes as 3 layers of darkness,
Right.
but it has nothing to do with pregnancy. So,
Right.
sorry. But I thought it was a pretty cool looking picture, and it
Sure.
does show 3 levels of darkness.
Yeah.
So does the Quran teach it? Well, not Sadat's laughable interpretation of these 3 very precise modern medical terms. But it does teach 3 layers, not surprisingly, since the Quran says that. And, oh, look, it picks 3 layers that would be easily observed to the naked eye. The abdomen, the placenta, and the uterus. Sorry, I forgot the Quran verse 36:6, I think. Whatever the Quran verse is. These are the commentaries on that verse, not on 23:12 through 14, just to be clear. So Ibn Kathir doesn't comment on it at all. He doesn't comment on the 3 darkness. Al-Tabari says it's the abdomen, placenta, and uterus or the womb. He gives multiple interpretations, but they all agree that it's used different terminology. Like they say the stomach, the placenta, and the uterus, or the abdomen, the placenta, and the womb, whatever. But basically the same 3 objects. And Kurtubi offers 3 different interpretations. He offers that one. It might also be this somewhat metaphorical interpretation of the placenta, the womb, and nighttime. I don't know why exactly, but some Muslim offered that as an interpretation, and Kurtubi felt it was worth quoting. Or it can refer to the man's back, the woman's belly, and the womb. Now, can you help us out here, Tony? Why would someone think that the man's back would be one of the 3 stages that life goes through?
Well, I think it's because the Quran says that semen comes from the backbone.
That would be my guess as well. So
back to the bone.
Yep. So in this interpretation, they're talking about the origin of the sperm between the backbone and the ribs, the area that the sperm goes into the woman, and the area the baby develops. So you can see how they might get that. Although abdomen, placenta, and uterus is probably what the Quran refers to. I'll grant that that's probably what the Quran means. It's just easily observable.
Yeah.
So is this a lucky yes? Well, in principle, you could say that there's 612 layers of the human body. So, picking the exact number of 3 is more than a lucky guess if there were actually exactly 3 layers. Conclusion, once again, sadly, there's no miracle here.
No.
The observance of layers would be easy in the 7th century, and the choice of precisely 3 layers is arbitrary. I don't have a slide for this, but Sadat did offer one more way that this passage is a miracle, supposedly. He claimed that no one had the idea that babies developed in stages in the ancient world, which is quite extraordinary because everyone describes babies growing in stages. The Quran doesn't use the word stages. Galen actually uses the word stages. He says explicitly there's 4 stages. The Talmud explicitly says there are 4 stages. They're not the same as Galen's 4 stages. They're all more metaphorical. They're not describing parts of the anatomy. They're describing a more metaphorical way, how the mind of the child develops, kind of.
Right.
How the body as a whole develops. But it is 4 stages, explicitly 4 stages. And it's also ironic because there actually aren't distinct stages. That's an error, right?
Yeah.
That there's distinct stages. It's a continual process. It's an arbitrary choice of human beings to say that there are distinct stages. So by claiming that the Quran, when it doesn't actually say that, makes distinct stages, and somehow it had this unusual knowledge, because modern textbooks for convenience often divide things into stages, but it's just for convenience. There's not really distinct stages. That this idea developed until modern times, that there's multiple stages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I do have my closing thoughts, but before I give my closing thoughts, I would like, and I'm happy to take questions as well, or comments, but I'd like to hear your closing thoughts first.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, this is just, I think that it is so obvious, the development of a child. If we look at the ancient world, these are issues that they would have been very familiar with. This is nothing unusual, and I just find it astounding that Muslim apologists would invest so much time into this area, when there is really nothing here that screams miracle. It's just incredible that they would invest so much time into this. But then again, that involves a lot of, as you pointed out, there's a lot of sleight of hand going on. They're interposing words into the Arabic that are not necessarily connected in the Quran. And so it just, to me, Thaddeus, it just seems to be ad hoc. The whole thing is ad hoc right from the get-go.
Yeah, and I generally say there might be some exceptions, but that's generally how all these scientific miracle things work.
Mm-hmm.
They start with a accurate scientific claim, and then they look for something in the Quran that they think could relate it. And this should be readily apparent it's readily apparent in a number of ways, but it's also readily apparent that the development of medicine, like the very early development of medicine, there were some Muslims involved with it, because the Muslim world, because of the conquest, they connected knowledge from different parts of the world, and they made some innovations.
Yep.
But no Muslim, since the very early days of what we might call the precursors of modern medicine, has made important contributions. Like, I'm sure some have made some contributions. I'm not claiming no one's made any contributions. But every single science-related Nobel Prize has gone to a non-Muslim. Yeah. If the Quran really had this advanced knowledge that was really there, then how come Muslims weren't proposing these ideas, like, the Big Bang, for example, before Westerners discovered these things?
Right.
And then suddenly, years after the science is somewhat settled, oh, look, the Quran teaches this.
After all, yeah. It's incredible.
So my conclusion, now you mentioned that Muslim apologists spend a large amount of time on this for no good reason. And I'd like to appeal to a Muslim apologist, Hamza Sortzes, who used to spend a lot of time defending this crap and no longer does. And I think that Muslims should take his example. So in October 2011, he spent a huge amount of time preparing this massive 58-page paper, attempting to prove that Surah 23, which is primarily what we looked at today, that the embryology there is miraculous. He spent tons and tons of time analyzing the words, trying to prove that the words meant what he said they did. Well, he was pretty proud of his work, I guess, because he spent the next 6 months purposely seeking out atheists and engaging them on this topic. He went to conferences that were atheist conferences, where Richard Dawkins or another famous speaker was there. And he engaged with them. And they kept pointing out mistakes he made in the science. They kept pointing out ridiculous logical leaps he made in his paper. And he kept working on it. He revised the document 4 times over the next 6 months and ended up expanding it all the way up to 78 pages.
Wow.
Then he gave up at some point. He stopped trying to engage with atheists. He stopped updating the paper, but he did leave it published on his website. So this is spring 2012. Well, in 2013, he came out publicly and said that he had abandoned the ideas of scientific miracles in the Quran. He deleted the paper from his website and deleted all his other arguments for scientific miracles that he had probably spent, hundreds of hours preparing these things.
Right.
And he just deleted them all because he realized that it was nonsense. And this is a direct quote from him. Regrettably, the scientific miracle narrative has become an intellectual embarrassment for Muslim apologists, including myself. And then he went on in his this comes from his explanation of why he was rejecting scientific miracles, why he deleted all these articles. He went on to claim that because people had started responding to this, so up until, around this time, there weren't enough people responding to this, that it was kind of going unchecked. And people were, he says in this, that people were converting to Islam based on this information. But because people started to engage in it, that people started to take it seriously, they started to look at it, he claims that discovering that this was a fraud was cited as a major factor for many apostates. They discovered that this nonsense that they've been taught since children was completely a fraud and totally a argument from nothing. And they said, if that's not true, then what else isn't true? And they ended up leaving Islam as a result.
Wow.
So he says, a significant number of apostates from Islam, many of whom I had private conversations with, cite the counter movement, meaning the movement against scientific miracles in the Quran, work as a causal factor in deciding to leave the religion.
Right.
And then he goes on and says they probably had other reasons. I don't think anyone leaves Islam for intellectual reasons, blah, blah, blah. But people were citing these stupid scientific miracle claims. They believed them. They were taught by it. These were obvious. And then someone said, that's not true. And then they looked at it themselves and they said, yeah, that's not true. It's not there. They just made up a bunch of stuff. They pretended it was in the Quran. Well, if these people are lying to me about what's in the Quran, what else are they lying to me about? And I think that's what Muslims should do. Muslims should take a serious look at this stuff. And to his credit, Muhammad Hijab has made not such an explicit statement, but a similar statement that the Quran doesn't contain science, and he thinks it's a foolish mission to try to find scientific miracles. And I think that Muslims should take the view that the Quran is not making scientific statements, that these are poetical statements. And I think in almost all cases, that's actually true. When maybe now the embryology here is a little questionable. It does seem to kind of be making a scientific statement. When it says that semen's formed between the backbone and ribs, that seems to be a pretty clear scientific statement. I don't see any metaphorical purpose for that.
Yeah.
When it makes statements about the movement of the sun, maybe those are metaphorical. And they're wrong if they're scientific, but maybe those are metaphorical. So there aren't many places where I would say that it's actually making a scientific statement. So I think that this is certainly a much more intellectually honest position for Muslims to take. But here's the problem. Well, maybe not problem, but here's the challenge. If this is your reason for believing in Islam and you reject this, you need some more positive evidence. You can't believe in Islam just because you think Christianity is false.
Right.
You can't believe in Islam just because you think Hinduism's false. You need positive evidence for the truth of Islam. And this is only one of like 3 or 4 claims that are even attempted as positive evidence that an outsider might accept. And frankly, the other ones are basically lies too.
Right.
So I'd say, reject the scientific miracle idea, and honestly seek after truth. See if there are any positive reasons to believe in Islam. And, I really haven't found anything that I would say holds up to scrutiny, like even as an insufficient reason. I haven't even found anything that's true.
Yeah.
Right? Like for example, if the perfect preservation of the Quran was true, I would say that's an insufficient reason, but it's not true either. Right? So, I mean, there are things that I would accept as evidence, that I would accept as true evidence, but insufficient evidence. And I don't really even have anything like that. The only thing that I would even remotely consider as somewhat evidence is that Muhammad was successful, or whoever founded Islam was successful, which is a necessary condition of the true religion. So I would consider that as a piece of evidence, but it's obviously not sufficient, right? Because he's not the only one that was successful.
Yeah.
There are other successful religions. So I would say that counts as a piece of evidence. And that's really the only thing I can think of that I would even consider a piece of evidence.
Right.
So that's all I have for you, unless there are comments or questions.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Thaddeus. That was a tour de force, a fine presentation. Really, I really enjoyed that. And so To our viewers, being joined tonight with Thaddeus from Reasoned Answers. Links to his website, his YouTube channel is available in the description box. And so if you have any questions on the topic, embryology in the Quran, please place a Q in your in the chat there. Place a capital Q, put in your question, and we will get to it. So Isaiah 53, thank you so much for your super sticker. Really appreciate that. God bless you. We do have a question here. Let me bring that up here. We have a question from Born Again RN, Steve. If Muslims understand Arabic better since they sing it in prayers, does this mean I know German since I can since I can sing 99 red balloons in German and Greek since I sing Kyrie eleison by Mr.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I mean, this you have to know Arabic claim is the height of intellectual laziness.
Yeah.
Because one, if it means that, just explain how the Arabic means something. Don't tell me I have to know Arabic. Tell me, which word means it and how it means that, and then I can investigate that claim. Saying, oh, it works in Arabic, that's not valid. And two, as we've pointed out, somewhere around 85% of Muslims do not know Arabic. So if you have to know Arabic to understand the Quran, then apparently Islam is 85% smaller than it claims to be, because none of those people could actually understand it. Or you can look at this and say what's blatantly obvious, and you don't have to know anything to join Islam, but you have to know absolutely everything about everything in order to be able to leave Islam.
Yeah,
real honest position there.
Yeah, and the issue, of course, with this idea of Muslims will always say, well, the Quran is best communicated in Arabic, and that's why it really, ideally, it should not be translated. But obviously, there's 85% Muslims in the world who don't know Arabic, and so they need the Quran in their language. And the other problem as well is, what type of a God would require you to pray in a foreign tongue that 85% of Muslims don't know in order to communicate with him? The God of the Bible created all, from one man, he created all the nations on the planet. And God communicates, has communicated throughout history, not in just one standard language. The people of God have always translated. So you got the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, and then in the 3rd century BC, they translated it into Greek, and then others would translate it into Aramaic, into the Targums, and then of course later on the Latin translation of the Bible, and then the Ethiopic, Sahidic, Armenian, and so forth. And so historically, the people of God have always understood that the message of the gospel, the message of Scripture, is to be communicated in the lingua franca of the people. And so Christianity has never had that issue, maybe other than maybe the Roman Catholic Church and its Latin Mass and so forth. But outside of that, the whole point of the Reformers was to bring the Bible into the vernacular language of the people. And so it's just incredible to me, Thaddeus, that in Islam, you have this Arabic supremacy. There's no doubt about it. You talk about white privilege. This is Arabic privilege, and everything about it is Arabic. I mean, the God, Allah and Salat and Zakat and so forth, and the names that Muslims take to themselves. Let's face it, it is a form of Arabic supremacy, and the fact that this God can only be addressed in that language really says to me that this is not a God who makes himself available to all the peoples of the earth. I don't know if you want to add to that, Thaddeus.
Well, yeah, I'll add a couple comments. First, on Christianity specifically, a large number of languages have a written script, specifically because Christian missionaries wanted to translate the Bible into the language people were speaking, and they needed a way to write it down. So they developed an alphabet for these languages. So in many languages, the very first book ever written in that language is a translation of probably a gospel. So yeah, Christians want to spread, and we believe that the word has power, and we believe that the word is how people are saved.
Right.
Muslims, in theory, have the same idea. And there was a push a number of years ago, and don't quote me precisely when, but some of the rich oil companies, probably led by Saudi Arabia, put a huge, massive amount of money behind translating the Quran into a bunch of vernacular languages.
Mm-hmm.
And what they found is that at least sometimes translating into the vernacular caused people to apostatize. Because suddenly they could read it in a language they understood, and suddenly they could see this is not the literary masterpiece I was told it is. There's nothing beautiful here. It's highly repetitive. It's disorganized. It doesn't make a lot of sense in many places. And they'd say, this isn't what I thought it was. You know, I heard all these claims, and now I'm reading it, and they don't match up. So they kind of abandoned that initiative. I mean, they may still spend some money on translation.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not claiming that, you know, some conspiracy. They just chose not to spend money in that way anymore. They chose to spend it on sponsoring universities and building mosques and other ways, rather than translation.
Right. And you know, when I'm just thinking of Yusuf Ali's translation, which I think is probably the worst, because he deliberately changed words, added words, like the word Trinity was added into his English translation, when we know the word Trinity never appears in the Quran. The Quran uses the word thalatha, the three, but it never uses the word tathlith, which is the Arabic word that Christians use for the Trinity. And so it's sad that even in the English translations of the Quran, a lot of stuff is added to the text. And so it's ironic, Thaddeus, that Muslims accuse Jews and Christians of corrupting the scriptures, and there they are corrupting the Quran by changing the English text of the Quran. But, you know, the gospel message, at the end of the day, the gospel is really a message. It's not, you know, the Quran confuses the gospel with a book, right? The Injil is one of the books. It's the book given to Jesus. And yet the Injil, the gospel, is not a book. The Injil is a message. It's the good news of God's love in Christ. The word is used to refer to the documents that talk about the life of Jesus, but ideally the gospel is a message. It's a kerygma. It's a proclamation of the good news of God's love for us in Christ. So, yeah, so very different. You know, they call us the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book. But our views of the book are very, very different.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And I did want to also comment on your comment about Allah being deficient because he only speaks Arabic.
Yeah.
And I guess there's kind of two possibilities. One is that he's stupid, and that's the only language he understands, which means he's inferior to human beings who can master more than one language.
Yeah.
Or more probably, which is what you alluded to, is that he is very distant. He doesn't care about his creation. He wants things done one particular way.
Yeah.
And in which case, you know, that's consistent with the picture of Allah, I would say. But it can't be the universal religion. No. It just can't be. And the Quran doesn't. The Quran actually doesn't think it's the universal religion. It thinks it's the Arabic version of the same message that was given to all other people first. For some reason it only knows about Jews and Christians, but it claims all other nations have already received their messenger, already received the same exact message in their own language. And Muhammad's the last messenger, not because he's, you know, special, just because by coincidence it was the last language to get its messenger. And that's why the God only knows Arabic, because, you know, it's the version of that religion for Arabic. That's what the Quran seems to think.
Yeah.
And the historical foundations of Islam is really all about justification for the expansionary wars. Well, how do you justify those wars? You say that Arabs are better than other people, so they deserve to conquer all this territory. Yeah. And that's really what the religion is about at the core, is justifying Arabs' superiority. In fairness, they didn't exactly have concepts of race, but they certainly had concepts of tribes. They had concepts of people group. So that it's about one particular people group achieving dominance over other people groups. And that's what it's about. And you alluded to people taking Arabic names, saying their prayers in Arabic, and so on and so forth. Because, well, you didn't mention this, but dressing like Arabs also.
Yep.
Dressing like you live in the desert. There's nothing wrong with the clothes that they wear in Arabia, but they're desert clothes. They're clothes intended to be worn in the desert. They make sense for that region. They don't make sense for other regions, but people adopt those clothing, and they all pray in a particular direction, facing the Kaaba, because it's about the superiority of the Arab people.
Yeah.
That's what the religion was founded on, and it retains that today.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about the fact that here in the West, Thaddeus, we're still in a state of self-flagellation where we're talking about the colonization of the white Europeans. Then we keep going on about the slave trade and so forth, and yet Islamic colonization. Why is most of North Africa Muslim, and why is the majority of the Middle East Muslim, and India and major parts of India, and why are most of these countries, and South Asia like Malaysia and Indonesia, which has more Muslims per capita than any other country in the world? No one talks about this. No one talks about the Islamic conquests and the colonization. And here in Canada, we have the whole issue about how, well, we suppress the Aboriginal Native American people and so forth. Well, that's what Islam did by imposing Arabic and Arabic architecture and Arabic names and so forth and so on. So it's interesting that that no one talks about that. It's just not. It doesn't fit the narrative. But you're absolutely right that there is no doubt that in Islam, Muslims are better. They are the best of all peoples. And who are the lowest, the most vilest are those Jews and Christians who reject the messenger of Allah, according to Surah 98, verse 6. They are the vilest, the worst of creatures. So there's no doubt about it that we definitely have that. We have a question here, Thaddeus, from Michael. Have you been able to lead any Muslims to the gospel? You take that first, Thaddeus.
Yep. So I will answer it the accurate way first, and then I'll answer it the way intended. And that's that I don't lead anyone to Christ, that the Holy Spirit does that. But yes, I have had the satisfaction of Muslims telling me that my ministry was a major factor in them coming to Christ.
Praise the Lord. And in my case, just like Thaddeus said, I've never converted a soul in my life. God, the Holy Spirit, is the one who convicts and regenerates the heart and gives life and so forth. The Lord has been gracious to use my ministry as well to see Muslims come to Christ. I've had the honor of baptizing many of them who come to faith in Christ. And let me just say this: they do make the best Christians. They were so zealous for a false God, a false prophet, and a false book, and once they find Jesus Christ, they use that zeal to exalt Christ and promote the gospel. So. In my experience, Thaddeus, I find that Muslims make one of the most zealous Christians.
And it makes sense because, if you grow up in Christianity, oftentimes you take it for granted.
Yes.
You don't realize exactly what you have, and you grow up outside the church. You see a lot of Christian apologists. A large percentage of them are converts from atheism.
Yes.
Since atheism is more common,
yes.
obviously, in the West. Same idea, though. They come from outside the faith, so they actually realize what they have, because they realize what they didn't have at one point.
Definitely. And we have just another question here from Steve. How do you respond to Muslims claiming English translation of the Quran are inaccurate to get around obvious errors like sperm dropping from between the backbone and ribs?
So I always first ask them if they know Arabic, because like we've pointed out, most don't. And if they say they don't, then I say, how do you know it's inaccurate? Because someone told you using a language you understand that it's inaccurate. So why can't the translation be accurate? Exactly. Yeah. And if they do know Arabic, then I say, okay, explain to me what it actually means in English. Be precise. Tell me what words correspond to what meanings. And no one has ever gone any further than that. Once I say that it's two things, the subject always disappears.
Yeah.
Or they repeat it, but they never address it.
Yeah, same here. I find that whenever you confront them with an uncomfortable idea, they will always say, well, you need to read it in the Arabic. And then you have someone who knows Arabic say, well, that's what it says in the English as well. They always play these games. Either it's not in the Arabic or you don't know Arabic, at which point I ask them if they know Hebrew and Greek. And they, well, I don't. Well, then you can't comment on the Bible since you don't know Hebrew and Greek. And so, or I'll hear things like, well, Jesus didn't speak Greek. He didn't speak Greek. He spoke Aramaic. And I said, well, why do you have him speaking Arabic in the Quran? He should be speaking Aramaic in the Quran, not Arabic. So you always end up with these games that they play, and I think, in my opinion, it's just desperation at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's really just a way to avoid whatever you're talking about. That's what it always really is. So then, as soon as you ask them, a probing question, then they can't go any further because ultimately they know they're just trying to avoid what's being talked about.
Yeah, it's the hot potato. When it's too hot, you just throw it to someone else.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Thaddeus. I really appreciate your time, and that was a splendid presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate you, appreciate your questions. Once again, please don't forget to like the video, and please subscribe to Apologetics to have other wonderful presentations like this. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. The Lord bless you and keep you, and we'll see you guys next time.